My daughter-in-law told my son, "Let's put this old woman's house in our name. It will be ours soon anyway." I was standing behind the door and heard every word. I quietly left, and the next day I changed my will. The next morning, they stood on my doorstep and, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I want to tell you about the house on Maple Drive, not the house itself. The white clapboard siding, the hydrangeas I planted the summer Ray and I moved in, the porch swing that still creaks on the left side no matter how many times I've oiled it. Those things you can picture easily enough. What I want to tell you about is what nearly happened to it and what I did when I found out. But first, let me tell you about the life I had before everything changed. My name is Margaret Holloway. I was 71 years old when this story began, and I had lived in my house on Maple Drive in Clarksville, Tennessee for 43 years. My late husband, Raymond, Ray, I always called him, and I raised our son Daniel in that house. We painted every room together. We buried our old dog Chester in the backyard under the oak tree. We celebrated Christmases and Thanksgivings and ordinary Tuesday dinners in that kitchen, the kind of evenings that don't seem important until they're gone. Ray passed 8 years ago. Heart attack, sudden and quiet, the way he lived. After that, it was just me, the house, the garden, my Tuesday bridge club at Dorothy Finch's place 2 streets over, and my volunteer work at the public library on Route 9. A small life, perhaps, but it was mine, and I loved it. Daniel was our only child. He lived 40 minutes away in Nashville with his wife, Christine. They had been married for 6 years by then. I will be honest with you, I never fully warmed to Christine. She was polished in a way that felt rehearsed, smiling at the right moments, saying the right things. She called me Margaret rather than Mom, which I told myself was simply a generational thing. Daniel loved her. That was what mattered, or so I believed. They visited on holidays and occasionally on weekends. Christine would admire the house in that specific way of hers, running her fingers along the mantelpiece, looking up at the high ceilings, making comments like, "This place has such good bones." I noticed it. I suppose I filed it away. The first real signal came in January. Daniel called to tell me that he and Christine were thinking about the future, their word, and whether it might make sense to plan ahead regarding the property. He spoke carefully, like a man reading from a script he hadn't quite memorized. I said I wasn't ready to discuss it. There was a pause. He said Christine thought it might save on taxes. I changed the subject. A week later, Christine called me herself. She suggested we have lunch, just the 2 of us. We met at a diner on the edge of town. Over a Cobb salad, she smiled and said that she hoped I understood they only wanted what was best for me. She mentioned a woman in her office whose elderly mother had let the estate fall into disarray because she hadn't planned properly. I listened. I said I had an excellent attorney and everything was in order. She smiled wider. We finished our salads and said goodbye. I drove home feeling unsettled in a way I couldn't quite name. Then came the Sunday in March. They had come to visit, as they sometimes did. I was puttering in the kitchen, making coffee, not paying particular attention to the conversation drifting from the living room. I had a slight cold and had come inside early from the garden. The acoustics in my old house are strange. Sound travels along the baseboards, funnels around corners. I was never sure they realized how clearly voices carried from that room. I heard Christine first, We should just go ahead and get it transferred now, Danny. Why wait? It's going to be ours anyway. Why let the lawyers take half of it when she goes? A pause. She's not going anywhere soon, Daniel said, quieter. She's 71 with a bad hip, and she lives alone. Danny, listen to me. If we get it put in our names now as a gift transfer, we avoid the whole probate mess. I talked to a real estate attorney. It's very straightforward. Another pause. She won't agree to it, Daniel said, and Christine's voice, clear as a bell, through the old walls of the house my husband and I built our life in. Then we convince her. She trusts you. Use that. I set down my coffee cup very carefully on the counter. I did not go into the living room. I did not let them see my face. I finished drying my hands on the dish towel, and when they came to say goodbye an hour later, I hugged my son and told Christine her earrings were lovely. I smiled. I waved from the porch, and then I sat in Ray's old armchair in the living room, and I stared at the wall for a long time. Was this really my son? I kept asking myself. Was this the boy I raised? I didn't have an answer that night. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had heard what I had heard, and I was not going to pretend otherwise. The next morning, I woke before dawn. That is not unusual for me. Since Ray died, sleep has been a lighter, more tentative thing. I drift in and out of it like a boat that isn't properly moored. I lay there in the gray half-dark and listened to the house settle around me. The familiar knock of the pipes, the wind pressing against the bedroom window. 43 years of those sounds, and they had never once frightened me. But that morning was different. I lay there and I counted what I stood to lose. The house on Maple Drive was appraised at just over $340,000, a number that sounds modest in some cities, but meant everything in Clarksville. It was paid off. Ray and I had made the final mortgage payment in 2003 and celebrated with a bottle of champagne we couldn't really afford. Beyond its dollar value, the house held the sum of my life. Every room had a layer of memory pressed into it like flowers in a book. The garden where I'd spent 30 summers. The kitchen table where Daniel had done his homework, where Ray and I had drunk our coffee every morning for decades. The oak tree in the backyard with Chester underneath it. If Christine had her way, all of that would be stripped of my name and placed under hers. I want to be honest about what I felt that morning. I felt afraid. Not the sharp fear of an immediate threat, but something deeper and colder. The fear of being made foolish, of discovering too late that the people closest to you were not who you believed them to be. I also felt something I hadn't expected, a kind of sorrow for my son. Because whatever Christine was, Daniel had listened. He had not said no. He had said she won't agree to it, which meant he had already considered agreeing. That was the thing that sat heaviest in my chest. But I am not a woman who lets grief paralyze her. Ray used to say I was the most practical person he'd ever loved. When the furnace broke the January after we moved in and we had no money, I called 3 contractors, negotiated with all of them, and had heat restored by Friday. When Ray got sick the first time, a scare, thankfully, not the final one, I organized his medical records, researched his condition, and sat in the cardiologist's office with a notepad and a list of questions. I have always believed that clarity is the best antidote to fear. So I got up, made my coffee, and I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad. I wrote at the top, "What do I know? What do I need? What can I do?" What I knew. Christine wanted the house transferred while I was alive, framing it as a gift transfer to avoid probate costs. She had already consulted a real estate attorney. She planned to use Daniel's relationship with me as the mechanism of persuasion. Neither of them knew I had heard. What I needed: legal protection, my own attorney, a clear understanding of my rights and my options, and I decided, updated documentation. Because while I had a will, it had not been reviewed since Ray died, and I was not certain it said precisely what I intended. What I could do: act before they did. Here is something I want you to understand about being 71 years old. People often mistake age for passivity. They assume that because your joints ache and you go to bed at 9 o'clock, you have somehow lost your edge. Christine had made that assumption. She had called me an old lady in her own kitchen to my son's face and had spoken about my death with the casual impatience of someone waiting for a checked bag to arrive at baggage claim. That was her first mistake. I called my attorney, Howard Blackwell, that same Monday morning. Howard had handled Ray's estate and drafted my original will 15 years ago. He was a quiet, precise man in his late 60s who wore the same style of brown Oxfords he'd worn for 30 years. I trusted him. "I need to see you," I said. "This week, if possible. It's about the house." He fit me in on Wednesday. Between Monday and Wednesday, I did not call Daniel. I did not call Christine. I went about my ordinary life. Bridge club on Tuesday, library on Thursday, and I let them believe that nothing had changed. That Sunday lunch had been a pleasant visit. The conversation in the living room had gone unheard, and the old woman on Maple Drive was still contentedly unaware. I was very good at letting them believe that. Was it deceptive? Perhaps. But then, so was everything Christine had said to me over lunch about planning ahead and saving on taxes. She had looked me in the eyes and used the language of care to conceal the mechanics of acquisition. I did not feel guilty about being quiet for a few days. On Wednesday morning, I dressed carefully in the navy blazer I wore to Ray's retirement party and the pearl earrings he'd given me for our 30th anniversary. I drove myself to Howard's office on Commerce Street. I sat across from him and told him exactly what I had heard. I watched him make careful notes in his precise handwriting, and I felt, for the first time since Sunday, that I was no longer standing alone. "What are my options?" I asked. Howard folded his hands on the desk and looked at me steadily. "Margaret," he said, "you have more than you might think." Howard's office smelled of old paper and coffee, a smell I had always found quietly reassuring. He had a framed map of Tennessee on the wall behind his desk and a small brass clock that ticked so steadily I sometimes found myself unconsciously measuring my breathing against it. That Wednesday, I sat across from him and listened carefully as he walked me through my position. The house was mine, free and clear. No one could compel me to transfer it. No one could add their name to the deed without my written consent and a notarized signature. A gift transfer of the kind Christine had described was perfectly legal, but only if I chose to make it, which I did not. But Howard was measured in the way good attorneys always are. "The concern," he said, "is not what they can do legally without your consent. The concern is what they might do with sustained pressure, and whether your current documents reflect your actual intentions." He was right about the documents. My original will, drafted in 2009, had left the house and the bulk of the estate to Daniel as sole heir. That had made sense at the time. Ray was gone. Daniel was my only child. I had not considered Christine. I had not considered what Daniel might come to mean in practice. "I want to change it," I told Howard. He nodded, unsurprised. To what end? I had thought about this carefully during the days between Monday and Wednesday, lying awake in the gray morning hours, turning the question over. I did not want to act out of pure spite. I am not a spiteful woman. But I was also clear-eyed enough to understand that what I had heard in my living room was not a momentary lapse. Christine had already retained an attorney. She had a plan. She had been building toward this conversation for some time, and she had recruited my son into it. I want to establish a trust, I said. The house goes to a charitable organization of my choosing upon my death, with a life estate retained for me, meaning I live here for as long as I choose to, and no one can compel me to leave. The remainder of the liquid assets I want divided between my friend, Dorothy Finch, and 2 charities. Howard was quiet for a moment. And Daniel. I folded my hands in my lap. Daniel made his choice, I said. He can appeal to me directly if he disagrees with it. The trust was drafted over the following 2 weeks. I reviewed every page. Howard was thorough. I was thorough. We communicated by phone and by email, and I signed the final documents on a Thursday afternoon in late March in Howard's conference room, with his paralegal and a notary present. The house on Maple Drive was placed in the Margaret Ray Holloway Living Trust. My name, Ray's name, the name of every year we had spent in that house. Now, what about Christine and Daniel? During those 2 weeks, I watched them carefully, the way you watch weather from a window. Daniel called twice. Once to ask if I was feeling well. Once to suggest we have dinner soon. Both calls were warm, careful, unremarkable. Christine texted me a photograph of a recipe she thought I might like. I thanked her, but I noticed things. The week after I visited Howard, Christine drove past my house on a Tuesday. I know this because Dorothy called me. Dorothy lives 3 houses down and notices everything, which is one of the reasons I love her, and mentioned she'd seen that silver Honda parked on the street for nearly 20 minutes. Just sitting there, Dorothy said, like she was taking stock. And 2 days after that, I received a call from a man who identified himself as a property consultant, asking whether I was considering any changes to my estate. I asked how he had gotten my number. He said he couldn't say. I thanked him and ended the call. How had they found a property consultant so quickly? I wondered. How had they known to send someone while I was in the middle of my own legal process? The answer, I came to believe, was that Christine had more resources deployed than I had initially understood. She had been planning this longer than I'd realized. The following Monday, Howard called me with something unexpected. His paralegal had been doing routine records checks as part of the trust setup process, and she had found something. A year prior, Christine had contacted the county assessor's office to request information about the property on Maple Drive, its assessed value, its ownership history, and the process for transferring residential real estate as a gift. The records of that inquiry were public. It had happened 13 months before the conversation I'd overheard in my living room. 13 months. I sat with that number for a long time. This had not been an impulsive idea Christine had mentioned to Daniel over dinner one evening. This was a calculated, sustained campaign. She had been researching my home, for over a year before I had any idea. She had looked up its value, understood the transfer mechanics, and spent 13 months laying the groundwork while smiling at me over Cobb salads and texting me recipes. I thought about all the Sunday visits, all the conversations about planning ahead, all of Christine's careful, pleasant, solicitous concern. And I thought, she thought I would never know. That was the moment everything crystallized for me. Not anger, or not only anger. Clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally see the full shape of a thing you have been looking at from too close. The trust was already signed. The deed was already secured. There was nothing they could take from me now through legal means. But I knew as surely as I knew my own name that they were not finished. The call from Daniel came on a Friday evening, the first week of April. I was in the garden, turning the soil in the bed along the south fence where I plant my dahlias every spring. It was the kind of evening Ray used to love. Warm enough for shirt sleeves, the air carrying a faint smell of earth and new grass. I had my gardening gloves on and mud on my knees, which is precisely where I prefer to be in April. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I looked at the screen. Daniel. I took a breath and answered, Mom. His voice was different, not the careful warmth of the previous 2 calls, something tight underneath it. We need to talk. Of course, I said. What about? A pause. Christine spoke to someone at the county assessor's office today. They mentioned the property records were accessed last week, a trust filing. Another pause. Did you change your will? There it was. I looked out at the dahlia bed. I've made some updates to my estate planning, yes, I said. It seemed prudent. The silence that followed was not a peaceful one. Mom, we should have talked about this. Christine and I… Daniel, I said, and my voice was very quiet, which is how it gets when I mean something absolutely. I am 71 years old. This is my house. My estate decisions are mine to make. You are my son, and I love you. But this is not a conversation that requires your participation. He said he wanted to come over. I said I was busy. He said it was important. I said I would call him next week. Then I took off my gardening gloves and went inside. The next morning, a Saturday, I heard a car pull into my driveway at 9:15. I looked through the front curtain. Daniel's truck, and Christine in the passenger seat. So I thought, here we are. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a second cup of coffee, and waited. In a moment, the doorbell rang. I let them in. I offered coffee. Christine declined. Daniel accepted, then didn't drink it. They sat on the living room sofa, the same sofa where they'd had that conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I sat in Ray's armchair across from them and looked at them steadily. Christine spoke first. She had composed herself. Her voice was measured, her expression one of concern. Margaret, we're worried about you. We've heard that. And we think this may have happened. That someone may have influenced you to make changes to your estate that aren't in your best interest. We just want to make sure you're protected. Protected, I repeated. There are people, Christine said carefully, who take advantage of elderly women living alone. We've seen it happen. We want to make sure your attorney… My attorney, I said, has handled my family's legal matters for 15 years. He is not taking advantage of me. Mom. Daniel leaned forward. His voice had gone soft in the way it used to when he wanted something as a child. We love you. We just want what's best for you. This house, it's part of our family. We've always assumed… I know what you assumed, I said. The room went very still. Christine's expression shifted. Just slightly. Just enough, Margaret. Her voice dropped a register. The pleasantness was still there, but something else had entered it. We have already consulted an attorney. If there is evidence of undue influence or diminished capacity, the trust can be contested. And there it was. Not concern, not love, a threat. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I looked at my son, who was looking at the coffee cup he hadn't touched. Christine, I said, I have been assessed by my physician twice this year, and my medical records reflect that I am in full cognitive health. My attorney is prepared to provide a detailed account of our consultations and my demonstrated decision-making capacity throughout this process. I have documentation of a 13-month pattern of inquiry into my property records that originates from your household. And I have a very clear memory of a conversation that took place in this room on a Sunday in March. I paused. Do you want to continue this conversation? Christine stood up. Her face had gone a color I hadn't seen on her before. Not anger exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something exposed. We'll be in touch, she said. They left. I stood at my front window and watched the truck back out of the driveway. Then I went to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and realized my hands were trembling slightly. Not from fear, from the sustained effort of staying very, very calm. I gave myself the weekend. I called Dorothy and asked if she wanted company. We sat on her porch and drank iced tea and talked about her granddaughter's school play, and I let myself be an ordinary woman for 2 days. Sometimes that is the most important thing you can do. The week after Daniel and Christine's visit, the gifts began. It started with flowers. A large arrangement of lilies and white roses delivered to my door on a Monday morning with a card that read, "Thinking of you. Love, Christine and Daniel." I put them on the kitchen table and looked at them. They were beautiful. They were also exactly the sort of gesture calculated to make a woman feel that perhaps she had been too hasty, too hard-hearted, too suspicious. On Wednesday, a fruit basket arrived. Expensive. The kind with the imported cheeses tucked between the pears, wrapped in cellophane with a silk ribbon. On Friday, Daniel called and asked if I wanted to have brunch on Sunday, just the two of us, no Christine. His voice was warm and careful. He said he'd missed me. He said he was sorry if things had gotten tense. He said he loved me. I told him I needed a little time. He said he understood. I wondered if he did. Now, I want to be honest about something. I am not made of stone. Daniel is my son. I changed his diapers. I sat beside his bed when he had the flu at age 7 and read to him for 3 hours straight. I taught him to ride a bicycle in this driveway. I was there the morning Ray died, and it was Daniel who held me afterward, and I who held him. Whatever Christine had made of him or helped him become, he was still the boy from all of those memories. But I had also heard what I had heard, and I understood very clearly that the flowers and the fruit basket and the gentle phone calls were not a change of heart. They were a change of strategy. What happens, I ask myself, when I relent? When I call Howard and say I want to revisit the trust? When I sit across from them and let myself be persuaded that I'd overreacted? I knew exactly what would happen. I had heard it through the walls of my own living room. So I kept the flowers because they were lovely, and I saw no reason to throw away lilies. And I gave the cheese from the fruit basket to Dorothy, and I said nothing to Daniel except that I needed time. But I was not idle. That week, I did 2 things that mattered. The first was that I told Dorothy everything. I had hesitated to do this. Dorothy and I have been friends for 22 years. She was Ray's colleague's wife, and she became mine long before she was ever his. And I trust her absolutely. But I am a private person. I do not easily spread my family difficulties through the neighborhood. I kept my own counsel for weeks before I finally sat down in her kitchen on a Wednesday morning, drank her terrible coffee, which I have been diplomatically not mentioning for 2 decades, and told her the entire story. She listened without interrupting. Dorothy is a retired school principal, and she has the particular quality of attention that comes from decades of listening to people tell her the truth about complicated situations. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" Not how terrible or I can't believe Daniel or any of the sympathetic indignation I might have expected. Just, what do you need? I told her I needed someone who knew the full picture in case anything happened. I told her about the trust and what it contained. I told her that she was named in it. Dorothy looked at me very seriously. "Margaret, you don't have to." "I want to," I said. "Ray would have agreed with me." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and that was that. The second thing I did was follow up with Howard about something he'd mentioned in passing. Whether I could legally document the nature of the pressure I was experiencing. He referred me to a colleague, an attorney named Sylvia Park, who specialized in elder law, and I met with her on Thursday. Sylvia was 40 years old and had the focused, slightly impatient energy of someone who has spent her career fighting for people who didn't fight for themselves in time. She reviewed everything: the records inquiry, the property consultant's call, the visit from Daniel and Christine, the threat about contested capacity. "You're ahead of this," she told me, "which is unusual. Most people come to me after things have gone wrong." "I heard them talking," I said simply. She smiled. "Keep a written log," she said. "Dates, times, what was said, who was present. If this escalates to a legal challenge, that record will matter." I went home and started the log that afternoon. I wrote down everything I remembered from the Sunday in March and everything that had happened since. I was precise. I wrote in the same small, clear handwriting I'd used to take notes in college, more than 50 years ago. And in the evenings, when the house was quiet and the trembling I didn't allow myself to show in daylight sometimes came back, I sat in Ray's armchair and reminded myself, I have already done it. The trust is signed. The house is protected. Whatever comes next, they cannot undo what is already done. That helped. Not completely, but enough. They came back on a Saturday in May. I had spent the morning in the garden, which is where I do my best thinking and my best not thinking, and I had come inside to wash my hands when I heard the car in the driveway. I looked through the kitchen window and saw Daniel's truck. This time, both of them got out. Christine was carrying a casserole dish. I want you to understand how deliberate that detail was. A casserole dish means I am not threatening you. It means I am a daughter-in-law bringing food. It means, can't we all just be reasonable? I dried my hands and went to the door. They came in. Daniel kissed my cheek. Christine put the casserole, some kind of chicken thing, it smelled of rosemary, on the counter, and said she'd hoped we could have lunch together if I hadn't eaten. Her voice was warm and slightly tentative, which she did very well. The art of the strategic retreat is knowing how to appear humble without actually conceding anything. We sat at the kitchen table. I served coffee. We talked for a while about ordinary things, Daniel's work, a film they'd seen, the weather, which had been unsettled. I let them set the pace. It is remarkable what you learn by being patient. Then Daniel folded his hands on the table and said, "Mom, we owe you an apology." I looked at him. The way we handled this, Christine and I, it was wrong. We were thinking about practical things and we didn't stop to think about how it came across to you. And then the conversation here. We were too aggressive. We scared you, and that was wrong. He sounded sincere. He may have been sincere in that moment. I genuinely don't know. But sincerity and honesty are different things. "We're not trying to take anything from you, Margaret," Christine said, with an expression of such careful earnestness that I felt briefly, unwillingly moved. "We just love this house and love what it means to this family, and we panicked when we thought it might go outside the family. We handled it badly." She paused. "Is there any chance we could revisit this together? Maybe the three of us sitting down with Howard or a neutral mediator? We'd just like to understand what you've decided and why, and share our perspective too. That's all." That's all. I sat with my coffee cup in my hands and looked at my daughter-in-law, who had researched my property for 13 months, who had called a property consultant to canvass my house while I was in the middle of a legal process, who had sat in this same room and threatened to challenge my mental competency, and who was now sitting across from me with a casserole dish and an expression of wounded reasonableness, asking me to go back to the table as equals. Was this a woman who wanted fairness? Was this a negotiation? I knew what a mediation session would look like. I knew how it would be framed. The elderly mother, the concerned adult child, the family home that held sentimental value for everyone. I knew how the pressure would build, gently, over multiple sessions until I was exhausted and the reasonable compromise they were steering toward felt like my own idea. I had seen it happen to other women. I was not going to let it happen to me. I appreciate the apology, I said. I mean that, and I love you both. I paused. But the trust is final. The decisions I've made are mine, and they are legally sound, and they are not open for discussion or mediation. My home will provide for the causes I have chosen in the manner I have chosen. That is not a negotiation. Christine's expression changed. The warmth drained. What was underneath it was cold and flat and very still. Margaret. Her voice was very quiet. You're making a mistake. Perhaps, I said, but it's my mistake to make. Daniel stood up. He looked exhausted and younger than 40 somehow. And I felt a pang for the boy I had raised, who had somewhere along the way learned to be a man who went along with things he should have refused. Mom, he said, please. I'll keep the casserole, I said. They left. I stood at the front window until the truck turned off Maple Drive. Then I went to my desk and wrote in my log, May 11th. Visit under the guise of reconciliation. Request for mediation declined. Christine's composure broke at the end. Daniel appeared conflicted. My hand was steady, but that night, lying in the dark, I thought, how far will she go? It was not comfortable, that question. But the discomfort of it, I found, did not weaken me. It clarified me. Whatever Christine decided to do next, she would find me ready. Howard called me on a Monday morning in early June. I've received a letter, he said, from an attorney representing Daniel Holloway and Christine Holloway, alleging undue influence in the establishment of the Margaret Ray Holloway Living Trust. I sat down. They're going through with it. It appears so. The letter requests documentation of your consultations, your medical records, and statements from anyone who may have been present during the trust's establishment. He paused. Margaret, this is not a lawsuit. Not yet. It is a formal inquiry, and my read of it is that it is designed primarily to intimidate. But I want you to be prepared. What do we do? We respond, Howard said, methodically and completely. I put the phone down and sat very still for a moment. I had known this was possible. I had told myself I was ready for it. But there is a difference between anticipating a blow and feeling it land, and this one landed squarely. They had actually done it. They had put their names to a legal document accusing me of being manipulated, me, in my own home, by my own attorney, in a process I had initiated, documented, and executed with full deliberation. I got up, went to the kitchen, and made a fresh pot of coffee. Then I sat at the table with my log and reviewed every entry from March onward. I had been thorough. I had written dates, times, exact words where I remembered them. I had not exaggerated, and I had not minimized. I read it through from the beginning to the end, and by the time I reached the last entry, I felt something settle in my chest. They could not win this, I thought, not with what I have. Over the following 2 weeks, Howard and Sylvia worked together on my behalf. I provided everything. My medical records from my physician, Dr. Karen Ellison, who had seen me twice in the previous year and documented my full cognitive health. The account notes from every consultation Howard and I had held, the records of Christine's inquiry at the county assessor's office, the log I had been keeping since March, which Sylvia read carefully and called exactly what we needed. And I provided one thing more. In the weeks since the May visit, something had been nagging at me, a detail I hadn't fully followed up on. The property consultant who had called me in March, the man who couldn't say how he'd gotten my number. I am not a woman who lets loose ends lie. I asked Dorothy's son-in-law, who works in real estate, if he could make inquiries through professional channels. It took him 10 days. When he called me back, he sounded uncomfortable, which told me before he spoke that he had found something. The property consultant's name was Marcus Webb. He operated a small real estate advisory firm in Nashville. Among his clients, confirmed through a professional association directory, was Christine Holloway. He had been retained by Christine, not recently, but 14 months ago. She had hired someone to assess and monitor my property 14 months before the conversation in my living room. I sat with that for a long evening. I thought about all the Sundays, the careful conversations, the Cobb salad, the casserole, the flowers, the fruit basket. All of it arranged against the backdrop of a 14-month campaign that began before I had any idea that my home was a target. I brought this to Howard, who brought it to Sylvia. Together, they incorporated it into the response package. The meeting was set for the second Thursday in June. It took place at Sylvia's office, not Howard's, neutral ground, her choice, deliberate. Daniel and Christine came with their attorney, a man named Garrett Pullman, who wore a very expensive suit and the specific expression of a person who is accustomed to winning. I noticed his cufflinks were gold. I noticed Christine had dressed carefully. A blazer, understated jewelry, the visual language of reasonableness. I understood exactly what each of them was doing, and the understanding gave me a cold, precise calm. We sat across the conference table from each other. Sylvia opened the meeting by presenting my medical documentation. Clear, thorough. Dr. Ellison had written a detailed statement. There was nothing there for them to use. Then Howard presented the timeline of our consultations. Every meeting dated and logged, every conversation documented in the paralegal notes. He presented my written log. Then Sylvia placed on the table the county assessor records, Christine's 14-month inquiry history, the property consultant engagement documentation. What we have here, Sylvia said, in the precise, quiet voice of someone who has done this many times, is not a case of undue influence on our client. What we have is a documented, multi-year pattern of coordinated effort to acquire our client's property through the exploitation of a familial relationship. She paused and looked at Garrett Pullman. Your client's claim of undue influence requires demonstrating that Mrs. Holloway was manipulated into acting against her own interests. The record shows something different, that Mrs. Holloway became aware of an ongoing effort to manipulate her, took appropriate legal counsel, and acted decisively in her own interests. That is the definition of competence, not the absence of it. The room was very quiet. I watched Christine. For most of the presentation, she had been still and composed. But when Sylvia laid down the property consultant documentation, when Christine's name was on the table in black and white, next to Marcus Webb's, next to a date 14 months prior, I saw something move across her face. Not guilt. Something more animal than guilt. The recognition of being caught. The specific, terrible stillness of a person who has realized that the evidence they believed was invisible has been sitting in a folder across the table this whole time. Garrett Pullman leaned over and spoke quietly to her. She spoke back in a hiss I couldn't hear. Daniel sat to her left and looked at the table. He had not looked up in several minutes. Mrs. Holloway, Garrett Pullman said, we would like a brief recess to consult with our clients. Of course, Sylvia said. They stepped out. Howard and Sylvia and I sat in the conference room. Howard poured himself a glass of water. Sylvia made a note on her legal pad. I looked out the window at the parking lot and the strip of blue sky above the buildings across the street. A pigeon was walking along the ledge of the building opposite, with the unhurried dignity of a creature that has never once been surprised by anything. What was Daniel thinking right now? I wondered. What was he thinking in that hallway with his wife, looking at the gap between what he'd believed and what had just been laid on that table? 20 minutes later, they came back. Garrett Pullman sat down, straightened his jacket, and said that his clients wished to formally withdraw the undue influence inquiry. In its entirety? Sylvia asked. In its entirety. I looked at my son. He was looking at a point somewhere past my shoulder. Christine's face was the color of old paper. Whatever she had expected from this meeting, a flustered old woman, a weak file, a gap she could press through, she had not expected this. She had not expected that the woman she had called an old lady to her husband's face had spent 5 months building an airtight case while smiling pleasantly and accepting flower deliveries. "Thank you," I said. And that was the end of it. The drive home from Sylvia's office that afternoon was one of the quietest drives of my life. I went by myself. Howard had offered to accompany me, and Sylvia had suggested a late lunch to debrief, but I wanted the drive alone. 20 minutes of familiar streets between the end of that conference room and the beginning of whatever came next. I drove with the windows down. It was a warm June day, the kind that smells of cut grass and asphalt, and the city moved past me in its ordinary way. People going about their ordinary business, entirely unaware that something had just concluded in a third-floor conference room that had taken 5 months and 43 years to arrive at. A woman walking a small dog, a teenager on a bicycle, a man carrying 2 paper bags of groceries with the careful balance of someone whose hands are just full enough. All of it ordinary. All of it exactly right. When I pulled into the driveway on Maple Drive, I sat in the car for a moment. The house looked the same as it always had. Clapboard siding, hydrangeas, the porch swing with the creaking left side, the oak tree visible around the back corner. 43 years of life in the same wooden bones. You're still mine, I thought. They didn't get you. I went inside and called Dorothy. I heard her take a breath when I told her it was over, and then she made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a sob, but somewhere in between. And I understood from it how worried she had been on my behalf. More worried, perhaps, than she had let me see. Because that is what a real friend does. Carries the weight of your situation without adding it to yours. Then I called Howard to confirm the written withdrawal had been filed. He read it to me over the phone, each clause, and when he finished, I thanked him and sat in Ray's armchair and simply breathed for a while. I thought about Ray. I wondered what he would have said about all of it, about Christine, about Daniel, about the strange and wearying journey from that Sunday in March to this Thursday in June. I thought he would have been angry initially, the way quiet men sometimes are when the anger finally arrives, and then he would have made a dry joke about it, and then he would have put his hand over mine and not said anything at all. I missed him with a sharpness that surprised me, even after 8 years. In the days that followed, I dealt with the remaining practicalities. The trust was already established and could not be challenged through the avenue Christine had tried. Sylvia, in consultation with Howard, sent a formal letter to Daniel and Christine outlining the documented history of their inquiries and actions, and noting that any future attempts to interfere with the trust's provisions would be met with a formal legal response. The letter was not threatening in tone. Sylvia was very careful about that. It was simply accurate, and accuracy was enough. I did not hear from Christine directly, not then, and not in the months that followed. Daniel called me once, about 3 weeks after the meeting. He sounded very tired. He said he was sorry. He did not say for which specific thing, for what he had known and gone along with, for what he had not prevented, for the look on his face in that conference room when the documents were laid out, or for all of it together. Perhaps he could not yet sort one from another. I told him I loved him, because I did, and I told him that the door was not closed, but that I needed time, And that trust, real trust, not the legal document kind, had to be rebuilt slowly and from honest ground. He said he understood. I hoped he did. There is something I want to address because I believe in being honest about complicated things. I did not feel triumphant after the conference room. I did not feel elated. What I felt was tired and clear, and something that I can only describe as settled. Like a house after a bad storm that has passed through. Things were knocked around. There was damage to assess. But the structure had held. The structure had held. 3 months after the meeting, I received correspondence from the charitable foundation I had designated as the primary beneficiary of the trust, the Clarksville Public Library Foundation, which supports the institution where I have volunteered for 11 years. They were grateful. They sent a lovely letter that I keep in the kitchen drawer, tucked behind the utility bills, where I see it when I'm looking for something else, and it reminds me briefly of everything it represents. Dorothy, who had been named for a modest bequest from the liquid assets, called me and told me she didn't want it. I told her the decision was already legal and final, and she was going to have to accept it. We argued about it pleasantly for 15 minutes, which is our preferred mode of deep affection. She said it was too much. I said Ray would have agreed with every penny of it. That ended the argument. I also made one additional decision in the weeks following the settlement. I had the porch swing repaired. Not just the left side, the whole thing, sanded down and refinished and rehung on new hardware. On a warm evening in July, I sat in it for the first time and swung gently back and forth in the cooling air. And it didn't creak at all. And I thought about Ray, and about the house, and about the long, careful, ordinary courage it sometimes takes to simply hold on to what is yours. And I felt, for the first time in a long time, completely at peace. The summer after all of it settled was the first summer in years that I spent entirely on my own terms. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center, something I had been vaguely meaning to do for a decade and kept postponing for no reason I could now remember. I am not a gifted painter. My hydrangeas look somewhat like anxious clouds. But I found that I didn't care in the least, and the instructor, a young woman named Elena, who had the patience of a saint, told me my use of color was surprising, which I chose to take as a compliment. Dorothy and I took a long weekend trip to the Smoky Mountains in August. We rented a cabin and walked the lower trails and ate too much pie at a diner outside Gatlinburg and talked for 3 days straight the way women of a certain age can, about everything and nothing. It was the best vacation I could remember since before Ray got sick. I continued my library volunteer work. I read to the children on Tuesday afternoons. We were working through the Little House books, which I had loved at 7 and still loved at 71. I helped organize a summer reading fundraiser that brought in nearly $3,000 for new acquisitions, including a graphic novel section I initially had doubts about and have since completely changed my mind on. My life on Maple Drive was quiet and full and mine. As for Christine and Daniel, I heard things, as people do in small enough circles, without looking for them. 6 months after the conference room meeting, Daniel and Christine separated. I did not learn the details. I did not seek them out. But Dorothy heard through a mutual acquaintance that the separation had been Christine's decision and that it had not been amicable. I sat with that information for an evening. I felt, honestly, more sorrow than satisfaction, not for Christine, but for the version of Daniel who might have existed if he had made different choices earlier, before things had calcified into what they became. He called me after the separation. We talked for a long time. It was not an easy conversation. There were silences that stretched, and things said carefully that had complicated undersides. But it was an honest conversation, which was more than we had managed for a while. He did not ask about the trust. I did not offer. What we talked about instead was Ray and a camping trip the three of us had taken when Daniel was 12, and whether I would consider having dinner sometime soon. I said yes. We have had dinner 4 times since then. It has been slow. It has been cautious. But it has been real, which is the only thing I have ever asked of anyone I love. Christine, from what I gathered without asking, did not thrive in the period after the separation. She had left her job at some point during or after the proceedings. The details were murky. And had moved to a city I did not know. I heard her name less and less as the months passed, and eventually not at all. What she did with the life she had so carefully engineered, I do not know. Some people build elaborate futures on foundations that cannot hold their own weight, and then must reckon with what they've made. I try not to be unkind in my thinking, but I try also to be honest, and honestly, I do not grieve the loss of Christine Holloway from my life. In the spring following all of it, the Clarksville Public Library Foundation broke ground on a small new reading room. I attended the ceremony. There was a ribbon cutting, and a local councilwoman made a speech, and the librarian, a young man named Paul, who has the enthusiasm of a person who has recently discovered that books are miraculous, which they are, read a passage from a children's novel to the assembled crowd. No one there knew the particular road by which a portion of the funding had been secured. That was fine. Good things don't require explanation. I stood in the afternoon sun with a plastic cup of lemonade and looked at the new room. The windows, the child-sized chairs stacked and waiting to be arranged, the shelves that would hold stories not yet read, and thought about Ray, and about the house, and about the strange, long, ordinary adventure of a life lived on your own terms. I was 72 years old. The hydrangeas were coming in beautifully. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I have thought a great deal in the time since about what I would tell a woman in my position. Perhaps younger than I was, perhaps older, perhaps simply someone who has felt, as I felt on that Sunday in March, the cold recognition that someone they trusted had been quietly calculating at their expense. Here is what I know. Your home is yours. Your life's work is yours. The love you gave freely was not a contract, and the people who try to convert it into one have misunderstood something essential about what love actually is. Act before they do. Document everything. Find people you trust, not just emotionally, but legally and practically. And do not mistake your own quietness for weakness or their confidence for strength. I was a 71-year-old woman standing in her own kitchen holding a dish towel, and I won. What would you have done in my place? I'd love to know your thoughts. Leave a comment below, and if this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for spending this time with me.